Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. And today we have a shocking revelation coming straight from inside Russia itself. For months we have seen the Kremlin trying to maintain its grip on the narrative of this war, using state-controlled propaganda to convince the Russian people and the world that everything is going according to plan. But now, in a stunning twist, some of the very same propagandists who once stood as Putin's loudest defenders are beginning to admit something that Putin himself has desperately tried to hide. Russia has already lost the war. This admission is not only extraordinary but deeply damaging to Putin's image as a leader who claimed strength, control, and inevitable victory. What we are witnessing is nothing short of a crack in the wall of Kremlin propaganda, and it tells us that the foundations of Putin's authority are weaker than they appear. When we look back at how this war began, the Russian propaganda machine was in full swing, painting a picture of an easy victory, claiming that Ukraine would crumble in a matter of days, and insisting that the West was too divided and too weak to respond. But as the months turned into years, reality has completely shattered that illusion. Ukraine not only stood firm but pushed Russia back from key territories, liberating lands that Moscow once proudly declared annexed. The West, far from collapsing in division, has rallied around Kiev with billions of dollars in weapons, training, and support. Even countries that once hesitated are now fully aligned in a long-term strategy to ensure Ukraine's survival. Against this backdrop, for Russian state media figures and even loyal propagandists to start admitting that the war is lost shows just how dire the situation has become. The Kremlin has always relied on the power of illusion. The idea that Russia is a global power, that its military is unmatched, and that its people are united behind Putin has been central to the propaganda effort. But illusions cannot hold forever when reality is so obviously different. Casualties continue to mount, with estimates suggesting that hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Mobilization efforts have drained communities of their young men, creating visible scars in Russian society. The economy, while surviving sanctions better than some expected, has been forced to transform into a war economy, sacrificing the future prosperity of millions for the sake of a failing military adventure. And now, when the Kremlin's own cheerleaders begin to acknowledge the truth, it is a sign that the lies are collapsing under their own weight. For Putin, this is a nightmare scenario. His entire political survival has always depended on projecting strength and inevitability. When he launched the invasion, he gambled everything on the idea that victory would secure his legacy and silence his critics. Instead, he has turned himself into a hostage of his own failure. The Russian people were told they were fighting a defensive war against NATO, that Russia was liberating Ukraine from supposed Nazis, that the world would respect Moscow's power. None of these things have materialized. Instead, Russia is isolated, its army is bleeding, and its leader is facing questions even from those who once never dared to speak out. Kremlin propaganda admitting defeat is not just words. It is a dagger pointed at the very heart of Putin's authority. This sudden shift in narrative is also telling us something important about the mood inside Russia. For propaganda to change, it means that the elites who control the messaging know the old story is no longer working. If they continue to say that victory is around the corner, while ordinary Russians see funerals, shortages, and endless mobilizations, then the propaganda loses credibility completely. By admitting that Russia has already lost, they may be trying to get ahead of a bigger collapse, preparing the public for what comes next. This could be an attempt to manage expectations, to soften the blow of future retreats, or even to position themselves for the post-Putin era. Because make no mistake, when propaganda no longer protects the leader, it often signals the beginning of the end. Ukraine, meanwhile, has every reason to seize on these cracks in the Russian narrative. Every time a Russian propagandist admits the truth, it strengthens Ukraine's case internationally and boosts the morale of its people. For Ukrainians who have endured brutal attacks, blackouts, and countless tragedies, hearing the enemy admit defeat is a powerful validation of their struggle. It shows that their sacrifices have not been in vain, that their resistance has broken through not only the Russian front lines, but also the Kremlin's wall of lies. This is a psychological victory as much as a military one, and in a war like this, psychology is everything. The fact that propaganda is shifting also tells us that divisions inside the Russian elite are growing. For years, Putin has maintained control by keeping his inner circle united under the belief that their survival depends on his survival. But if propagandists, generals, or oligarchs begin to see Putin as a liability rather than a guarantee of power, the balance could quickly shift. History shows us that authoritarian regimes often appear strongest right before they collapse. The image of unity is projected to hide deep fractures, and when those fractures are exposed, change comes rapidly. Kremlin propaganda admitting loss might be one of the first public signs of those fractures. It is also important to understand how dangerous this moment is. A weakened Putin is unpredictable. He may respond to these cracks not with retreat but with escalation. Already, we have seen Russia resort to desperate tactics. Mass mobilizations, missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, threats of nuclear weapons, all to try and reassert dominance. If Putin feels cornered, the temptation to lash out even more brutally will increase. This means that while the propaganda admission is significant, it also signals a volatile period ahead. The world must be prepared for a leader who may decide that if he cannot win, he will at least try to drag others down with him. From a strategic perspective, Russia's position is indeed dire. Ukraine's armed forces are better trained, better supplied, and more motivated. Western support continues to flow, with promises of long-term assistance that stretch years into the future. Russia, by contrast, has burned through its reserves, relies on outdated equipment, and is desperately seeking weapons from countries like Iran and North Korea. The balance of power has shifted, and no amount of propaganda can hide that. By admitting the war is lost, Kremlin loyalists are acknowledging a truth that military analysts have been saying for months. Russia cannot win this war in any meaningful sense. At best, it can prolong the suffering, but the strategic defeat is already locked in. This raises another critical question. What happens to Putin when even his own propaganda machine begins to abandon him? Leaders like Putin thrive on fear and control, but once fear begins to fade, and once the illusion of control is broken, the descent can be rapid. We have seen this in history, from the fall of the Soviet Union to the collapse of other authoritarian regimes. The speed at which propaganda is changing suggests that something similar could be brewing inside Russia today. Whether it comes in the form of internal rebellion, elite betrayal, or mass discontent, Putin's grip on power is now more fragile than ever. For the Russian people, this is a moment of reckoning. Many were willing to believe the propaganda because it was easier than confronting the painful reality. But now, with propagandists themselves admitting defeat, it forces ordinary Russians to ask, what was all this for? Why were so many lives sacrificed? Why was the country thrown into isolation and economic hardship for a war that could not be won? These are dangerous questions for Putin, because once they spread, they cannot be silenced. The more people realize the truth, the harder it will be for the Kremlin to control the narrative. At the same time, we must remember that the collapse of propaganda does not guarantee a quick end to the war. Putin may continue to fight even as his legitimacy crumbles. He may try to cling to power by doubling down on repression at home and destruction abroad. But history shows us that propaganda is often the last line of defense for regimes like his. Once it falters, the entire system begins to unravel. What we are witnessing now may be the beginning of that unraveling. The admission that Russia has lost is more than a statement. It is a signpost. It tells us that the Kremlin can no longer maintain the illusion of control, that the truth has become too obvious to ignore. It tells us that Putin is weaker than he appears, and that his future is uncertain. And most importantly, it tells us that the sacrifices of Ukraine and its allies have forced a reckoning inside Russia itself. For a leader who built his power on lies, the truth may prove to be his ultimate downfall. This is a story that is still unfolding, and the consequences will be felt not just in Moscow or Kiev, but across the entire world. The collapse of Kremlin propaganda marks a turning point, one that could shape the future of Russia, Ukraine, and the international order for years to come. As we watch this moment, we must remember that wars are not only fought with tanks and missiles, but also with words and ideas. And right now, the words coming from inside the Kremlin tell us more than any battlefield map ever could. Russia has already lost.